The gates of Willow Ridge Academy swung open under the golden rays of the morning sun, revealing the grandeur of one of Virginia's most prestigious high schools. The sprawling campus was a testament to wealth and privilege, with its manicured lawns, marble-paved courtyards, and state-of-the-art facilities. Expensive cars rolled into the parking lot, their polished surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. Groups of students stepped out, dressed in the latest designer clothes, carrying luxury bags, and exuding an air of confidence that came naturally to those born into privilege. Laughter echoed across the courtyard as they greeted each other, their voices blending into a symphony of entitlement. Among them, Alyssa Carter quietly stepped off the old school bus, her slightly worn-out sneakers gently touching the sidewalk. No one turned to look at her. No one welcomed her. At Willow Ridge, Alyssa was invisible. She didn't have a car, expensive clothes, or perfectly styled hair like the other girls. She didn't belong to the world of the wealthy, and they didn't bother hiding it. Alyssa tightened the straps of her backpack and walked quickly past groups of chatting friends, her head down, hoping to avoid attention. But at Willow Ridge, being invisible was sometimes better than being targeted. Madison Harrington, with her silky blonde hair and sharp blue eyes, was the epitome of perfection in the eyes of teachers and parents. She was not only beautiful, but also the daughter of a powerful family, with influence in both politics and finance. For Madison, everything could be bought: power, fame, and even control over others. And Alyssa, she was a stain in Madison's glamorous picture. "Look, it's the scholarship girl." Madison's voice rang out as Alyssa passed through the courtyard. "I wonder if she has enough money for breakfast today." One of Madison's friends snickered. "I bet she doesn't. Maybe she'll beg for food at the church like she always does." Alyssa bit her lip, but didn't stop. She was used to these taunts. At Willow Ridge, everything revolved around money. Those without it were invisible. But being ignored was sometimes better than being targeted by Madison. After each long day at school, Alyssa didn't return to a mansion or a fancy restaurant like her classmates. She went back to her small apartment, where her mother, Monica Carter, was still working her shift at the hospital. Their apartment wasn't big, but it was always warm. Monica, despite being exhausted from long hours, always tried to spend time with her daughter. But Alyssa knew her mother had sacrificed so much. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Monica asked, forcing a smile even though her eyes were darkened from lack of sleep. "Same as usual, Mom," Alyssa replied briefly, hiding the frustration of a long day of being looked down upon. But there was one thing that made Alyssa different, one thing that Madison and people like her could never take away: music. Since she was a little girl, Alyssa had loved the sound of the piano. While other kids played with dolls or watched cartoons, she would sit for hours at the local church's old piano, letting her tiny fingers glide over the worn keys. She had no teacher, no new music books, but that didn't stop her from learning. She listened to Debussy, Beethoven, and Chopin on her old phone and tried to play them with her own hands. She practiced with all her heart, borrowing music books from the library and studying every note. She didn't just play the piano. She lived in music. But at Willow Ridge, her dream had no place. Piano was a subject for the elite. Kids like Madison had the best teachers, hired by their parents, practicing on expensive grand pianos. And Alyssa, she could only quietly play in the corner of the church when no one was around. She had never dared to play in front of others. But all of that was about to change in just one moment. That day, Richard Grayson, the school's music teacher, announced that students would be required to perform an impromptu piano piece during class. "I want to see you express emotion through music, not just play pieces you've memorized," he said, his voice dry and stern. Madison, with her smug look, would obviously be the center of attention. She had been playing piano since she was 3 and had performed at major school events. Alyssa, on the other hand, didn't want to participate, but Mr. Grayson didn't let her escape. "Alyssa Carter," he called out, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Would you like to give it a try? Or are you just used to listening to music through headphones?" The whole class gasped and laughed. Madison sneered, folding her arms and looking at Alyssa with a challenging glare. Alyssa felt a chill run down her spine. Mr. Grayson wanted to humiliate her. Madison wanted to see her fail. Alyssa could refuse. She could shake her head and sit still, letting everything pass by like usual. But a part of her wouldn't allow that. She thought of the long nights spent practicing in silence, of the dreams she had never dared to voice. Then she stood up. All eyes turned to her. Alyssa Carter walked to the piano, and for the first time in her life, she decided to let the world know about her talent. Alyssa stood there, her hand lightly clutching the edge of her uniform, her breath shallow but hurried as every eye in the class fixed on her. The air thickened with anticipation, not the eager kind, but the cruel kind. Everyone wanted to see her stumble, to see her fail, to see her become the joke in a room full of people who had never had to struggle for an opportunity. At the center of it all, Richard Grayson watched her with a smile full of implications. He was a man in his 50s, thin but with gestures that exuded authority, the kind of power built over years of tapping a ruler on the desk without ever needing to raise his voice. He was a longtime music teacher who had taught at Willow Ridge Academy for over 2 decades, and his reputation among the upper-class parents had never wavered. The wealthy parents liked him. They liked the way he nurtured kids with potential, the students whose families could afford expensive private lessons, the kids who were already privileged and just needed a little push to reach the top. He held lavish performances and internal competitions where the chosen faces would shine, and those who didn't meet his standards would forever remain silent spectators in the back rows. To Mr. Grayson, Alyssa Carter didn't belong on that stage. He had never truly cared for students like her, the kids without family backing, without formal music training, without private tutors guiding each note. In his eyes, Alyssa was a faint name on the class roster, just a student who kept good enough grades to avoid being dropped, but nothing worth his attention. And so, when he saw her sitting there, silent amid the giggles of Madison and her friends, an idea suddenly sparked in his mind, a lesson to remind Alyssa Carter that she had no place here. Mr. Grayson slowly walked to the center of class, the sound of his leather shoes clicking on the wooden floor, a noise that made the room even more silent. Then, in a prolonged tone, he spoke. "Alyssa Carter, perhaps you'd like to give it a try. Or are you just used to listening to music through headphones?" His words weren't loud, but they were sharp, like a well-honed blade. And immediately, the class erupted in laughter. Madison smirked, crossing her arms while others turned to whisper, exchanging mocking glances. A few even covered their mouths, as if holding in their laughter at something far too amusing. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just asking a student to stand and perform. He was calling out someone who, in his view, had no chance of succeeding. He was creating a situation he knew would make Alyssa uncomfortable, would undermine her confidence in front of her peers, would show her that some doors were never meant to open for people like her. Alyssa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She didn't want to step up. She didn't want to become the entertainment for people like Madison. Didn't want to let Mr. Grayson get what he wanted. She knew she could refuse. She could shake her head, say she didn't want to play, say she wasn't good at the piano, say she hadn't prepared. Surely, he wouldn't force her. Though he had power, he couldn't make a student perform before the class. But if she did that, if she stayed seated, if she refused, it would become the truth. The laughter, the scornful looks, all of it would affirm that Alyssa Carter was nothing special, that she didn't deserve music, that she was just a poor girl who knew nothing but to dream. She clenched her fist. Then, in a brief but decisive moment, she looked up. She stared straight into Mr. Grayson's eyes, those eyes still gleaming with expectation, waiting to see her shake her head, waiting to see her admit she was too scared. But instead, Alyssa took a deep breath and slowly stood up. The room seemed to shrink as the 15-year-old girl walked to the center of the room, each step heavy as though a ton of weight were pulling her down. All eyes remained locked on her, but this time, it wasn't just mockery. It was also a certain curiosity. Madison squinted, watching Alyssa's every move, as though not believing this girl dared to accept the challenge. Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow, looking slightly surprised, but quickly hid the expression with a small smile. Alyssa walked to the grand piano in the center of the room, the wooden chair creaking beneath her as she sat down. Her hands rested on the keys. The laughter had stopped, but the air still hung heavy with expectation. She knew she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She knew that if she played clumsily, if she revealed even a hint of hesitation, no one would ever let her forget it. Mr. Grayson crossed his arms and nodded, a challenge in his eyes. "Go ahead, Carter. We're all waiting." Alyssa closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them, her fingers began to move. A note rang out. Then two. Softly, gently, like a breeze passing over the driest, heaviest things. The room held its breath. The first sound echoed, a soft, low note, like a drop of water falling onto a still pond. But before it could fully resonate, a muffled giggle broke out somewhere in the classroom, tearing apart the fragile atmosphere Alyssa was trying to create. She felt it immediately, a heavy, invisible pressure on her chest, as if every nerve in her body had suddenly tightened. Eyes, dozens of them, were staring at her, not with curiosity or expectation, but with mockery. From the corner of the room, Madison tossed her hair back, crossed her legs in a practiced manner, and turned to her friends with a scornful sneer. She didn't need to say anything. Just that raised eyebrow was enough to make the group burst into laughter. "Well, sounds promising." A girl's voice chimed in, laced with laughter. "She probably hasn't even touched a real piano before." Another one whispered, but loud enough for Alyssa to hear. Alyssa didn't need to turn around to know who was saying what. She could feel every glance, every disdainful look that swept over her like razor-sharp blades. Some were whispering to each other, others were smirking. But they were all waiting for her to fail. And at the center of it all stood Mr. Grayson, his expression betraying nothing but indifference. He didn't laugh, but the way he folded his arms, tilted his head ever so slightly, spoke volumes. This wasn't a music test, it was a trial. He was sure Alyssa would fail. He had seen kids like her before, outsiders, dreamers, crushed by reality. Alyssa was just another one of them, and he didn't need to say it out loud to be sure she wouldn't change anything. Alyssa blinked, but not to focus. She was trying to push back the old memories that were flooding in. She remembered the first time she touched the keys of the old church piano. Its keys were worn, some chipped, but to her, it was more beautiful than all the expensive pianos Madison and the others had. She remembered the late nights when her mother came home after a long shift, still trying to smile even though her eyes were tired beyond belief. She had worked tirelessly, not to buy Alyssa a shiny piano or a new dress like the other girls had, but just to make sure there was food on the table and a roof over their heads. She remembered the rejections, the scholarships she applied for but never received, the pitiful advice from her old teachers. "Alyssa, you should focus on something more practical instead of chasing a distant dream like music." All of it once made her want to give up. And maybe, if this had been another time, another place, another day, she would have. She would have lowered her head, sat back down, and let Madison and Mr. Grayson have what they wanted. But today, something had changed. Alyssa took a deep breath, her fingers still on the keys. But this time, she didn't tremble. She could lift her head, look Madison in the eye, look at those who were waiting for her to fail, and say she didn't want to play. She could turn to Mr. Grayson, pretend to be confused, pretend not to know how to play, so he could sneer, shake his head, and move on to another student. She could take the easy way out, but she didn't. She didn't know what had changed. Maybe it was the long nights of silent practice. Maybe it was her mother's words. Maybe it was the pain that had been lingering too long. But now, she didn't want to run anymore. She didn't need to prove anything to Mr. Grayson. She didn't need to make Madison change her mind about her. But she needed to prove to herself that she wasn't as small as they wanted her to believe. She relaxed her shoulders, her fingers lightly gliding over the keys. And this time, when she played the first notes, nothing could stop her anymore. The classroom gradually fell silent. The mocking laughter that had once filled the air seemed swallowed by the first notes of Claire de Lune. Alyssa was playing. Mr. Grayson, still standing with his arms folded, suddenly stopped. His eyes narrowed as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Madison, who had been lounging against the desk with a carefree attitude, now sat up straight, her brows furrowed in a way she had never done before. The other students, the ones who had scoffed when Alyssa's name was called, now fell silent. Because they hadn't expected this. They had been waiting for awkwardness, wrong notes, the trembling of each key. They had expected a spectacle, but instead they heard only pure, emotional music that silenced them all. Alyssa didn't look at anyone. She just closed her eyes and let the music lead her, because she knew that this was the moment when she had to let the world see who she truly was. The sound of the piano echoed, at first as light as a breath, but each note seemed to tear through the heavy air in the classroom. Alyssa felt the shift, a moment when no one dared to laugh, no one dared to whisper. But she knew this was just the beginning. She took a deep breath, her fingers lightly grazing the keys, each finger quietly searching for certainty. But just then, a sudden wave of fear surged within her. She almost got up to leave. It felt as though an invisible force was pulling her away from her seat, as if she stood up now. She could escape the judgment, escape the eyes waiting for her to make a mistake, escape Madison and Mr. Grayson, those who never wished her success. She could leave. But then, like a breeze passing through her mind, her mother's voice appeared, gentle yet firm. "You don't need to prove anything, but never let anyone look down on you." Those words were like a small light in the dark room, yet they were the only thing that helped her move forward. Alyssa opened her eyes. She didn't leave. She stayed. Madison propped her elbows on the desk, tilting her head arrogantly, her sharp green eyes fixed on Alyssa. She didn't say anything, but the raised eyebrow and half-smile said it all. Asterisk, go ahead. Show us how bad you are. Asterisk, the others in the class were the same. Some still whispered. Others simply crossed their arms, leaning back in their chairs, ready to laugh if Alyssa made a mistake. Then, her gaze met Mr. Grayson's. He stood there, no longer smiling as before, but now wearing an expression that Alyssa couldn't read. It wasn't exactly amusement, but it wasn't entirely surprise either. It was like a hunter observing its prey, a calm waiting, because he was sure he knew what would happen next. He was certain she would fail. Alyssa felt her heart race, not because of fear, but because she was standing at the most important crossroads of her life. If she played, she would step beyond it. If she failed, she would forever be bound by their mockery, forever the girl who didn't belong in this world. And she wouldn't let that happen. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then she began to play. The first note sounded, followed by a sudden silence so deep that Alyssa herself felt as though she had stepped into another space. This space no longer contained mocking laughter, no longer filled with whispers, no longer any sound except the piano gradually enveloping everything. The soft yet powerful melody of Claire de Lune spread, each note weaving a shimmering picture in the room that had once been cold and rigid. Madison stopped laughing. She sat up straight, her eyes wide open, no longer with the teasing excitement she had before. The other students, who had expected a clumsy performance, could only sit still. Mr. Grayson, the man who had always maintained a calm expression, furrowed his brow slightly, a tiny reaction that couldn't hide his confusion, because they hadn't expected this. They thought Alyssa would tremble. They thought she would hit the wrong note, that she would stop, that she would be afraid. But all they got was a performance that left them speechless.